Real-Time 1960s presents Evening Report, a complete roundup of today's news with Joe Rubenstein.
Good evening. In Washington, President Kennedy speaks out on Cuba. In Georgia, 2 Negro churches are burned. In London, Dr. Robert Soblen is dead. Rachel Carson is criticized, Lenny Bruce is banned, and Jimmy Piersall is arrested. Those are the headlines. The details after this message.
Into the deepest jungles went Pressman toy makers looking for something new. The secret they brought back for you is incredible. The Pressman Witch Doctor Head Shrinkers Kit. Plastic flesh, mixing cauldron and petrifying potion. Just pour it into the mold and in minutes you can add monster hair. Paint it with a coloring kit included or make up your own decorations. In 24 hours the heads shrink down. Now shrunken heads for all occasions. Collect them, swap them, give them to your Witch Doctor friends. You can always cook up more with Pressman's Witch Doctor Head Shrinkers Kit.
In a carefully worded statement at the start of today's press conference, President Kennedy addressed growing concerns about the Soviet buildup in Cuba.
In the first place, it is Mr. Castro and his supporters who are in trouble. In the last year, his regime has been increasingly isolated from this hemisphere. His name no longer inspires the same fear or following in other Latin American countries. By his own monumental economic mismanagement, supplemented by our refusal to trade with him, his economy has crumbled, and his pledges for economic progress have been discarded, along with his pledges for political freedom. His own followers are beginning to see that their revolution has been betrayed. So it is not surprising that in a frantic effort to bolster his regime, he should try to arouse the Cuban people by charges of an imminent American invasion and commit himself still further to a Soviet takeover in the hope of preventing his own collapse.
At the same time, the president criticized what he called loose talk in this country about U.S. military intervention.
If the United States ever should find it necessary to take military action against communism in Cuba, all of Castro's communist-supplied weapons and technicians would not change the result or significantly extend the time required to achieve that result. However, unilateral military intervention on the part of the United States cannot currently be either required or justified. And it is regrettable that loose talk about such action in this country might serve to give a thin color of legitimacy to the communist pretense that such a threat exists.
Finally, the president issued a warning along with a list of transgressions that could bring U.S. military action.
If at any time the communist buildup in Cuba were to endanger or interfere with our security in any way, including our base at Guantanamo, our passage to the Panama Canal, our missile and space activities at Cape Canaveral, or the lives of American citizens in this country, or if Cuba should ever attempt to export its aggressive purposes by force or the threat of force against any nation in this hemisphere, or become an offensive military base of significant capacity for the Soviet Union, then this country will do whatever must be done to protect its own security and that of its allies. We shall continue to keep the American people and the Congress fully informed. We shall increase our surveillance of the whole Caribbean area. With this in mind, while I recognize that rash talk is cheap, particularly on the part of those who do not have the responsibility, I would hope that the future record will show that the only people talking about a war or an invasion at this time are the communist spokesmen in Moscow and Havana, and that the American people, defending as we do so much of the free world, will in this nuclear age, as they have in the past, keep both their nerve and their head.
Meanwhile, the Soviet Union warned this week that any attack by the U.S. on Cuba or upon Soviet ships bound for Cuba would result in nuclear war. In a government statement released on Tuesday, Moscow pledged once again to defend Cuba with rockets. The statement said materials being sent to Cuba were, quote, exclusively for defensive purposes, unquote. Finally, the statement implied that Republicans in Congress are pushing for military action on Cuba to improve their own chances in the upcoming midterm elections. At today's press conference, the president responded to this last implication by the Soviets.
Well, I would not want to comment on the extent of the Soviet knowledge of our free elective process, nor would I suggest that the concern over Cuba is due to the election. I think the concern is due to the fact that Cuba is close to the United States territory and that Cuba is obviously tying itself closer to the communist bloc The arrival of these weapons and technicians has caused increasing alarm by not only the members of Congress, but also by the administration and by the American people. I would not suggest that those who are concerned about it are motivated by political purposes, or that the Soviet judgment that they are is accurate.
Even so, many Republicans remain highly critical of what they call the president's do-nothing policy on Cuba. Among the harshest critics is Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, viewed by many as President Kennedy's most likely opponent in 1964. Today, Senator Goldwater had this to say, quote, "We have before us a humiliating picture. The Soviets pushed a huge military buildup on our southern doorstep. Khrushchev warned the U.S. not to interfere, and President Kennedy holds a news conference and says military intervention by the U.S. cannot be either required or justified. To say the least, President Kennedy is a very poor poker player. Even if the thought of invading or blockading Cuba is completely repulsive to him, it does us no harm to keep Castro and his Soviet masters guessing," unquote. In Terrell County, Georgia early Sunday morning, 2 Negro churches were destroyed by fire. The fire at the Mount Olive Baptist Church, site of a recent voter registration drive, started at 2 a.m., and the blaze at Mount Mary Church, about 5 miles away, began an hour later. Jackie Robinson, the former baseball star, traveled to the ruins of both churches on Sunday. Mr. Robinson immediately announced that he would lead a fundraising effort to rebuild both churches, adding, quote, "It is a sad situation when even the most rabid segregationist would stoop this low to defy the wrath of God and burn his house," unquote. At today's press conference, President Kennedy denounced the burning of the churches, along with any other attempt to hinder voter registration efforts through either intimidation or terror.
I don't know any more outrageous action, which I've seen occur in this country for a good many months or years, than the burning of a church, 2 churches, because of the effort made by Negroes to be registered to vote. The United States Constitution provides for freedom to vote, and this country must permit every man and woman to exercise their franchise. To shoot, as we saw in the case of Mississippi, 2 young people who were involved in an effort to register people, to burn churches as a reprisal, with all of the provisions of the United States Constitution, at least the basic provision of the Constitution guaranteeing freedom of worship, I consider both cowardly as well as outrageous. The United States now has a number of FBI agents in there, and as soon as we are able to find out who did it, we'll arrest them. And we'll bring them before a jury, and I think that I'm sure they'll be appropriately dealt with. The right to vote is very basic. If we're going to neglect that right, then all of our talk about freedom is hollow, and therefore we shall give every protection that we can to anybody seeking to vote. I hope everybody will register. I hope they will vote. I commend those who are making the effort to register every citizen. They deserve the protection of the United States government, the protection of the states, the protection of local communities, and we shall do everything we possibly can to make sure that that protection is assured. And if it requires extra legislation and extra force, we shall do that.
In related news, Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black ruled Monday that the University of Mississippi must admit a Negro for the first time this fall. Justice Black nullified a series of court orders that would have postponed the admission of James Meredith, a 29-year-old Air Force veteran. Tonight, in a statewide TV and radio address, Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett said that under a resolution adopted by the state legislature in 1956, he was interposing the sovereignty of the state between the federal government and the people of Mississippi. The governor added, quote, "No school will be integrated in Mississippi while I am your governor. I assure you that they will not be closed if this can possibly be avoided, but they will not be integrated," unquote. The doctrine of interposition was last invoked in 1960 by the state of Louisiana in a separate school integration case. In that instance, the Court of Appeals dismissed the doctrine, stating, quote, "Interposition is not a constitutional doctrine. If taken seriously, it is illegal defiance of constitutional authority," unquote. Even so, the governor's televised pledge, along with his apparently firm intention to carry it out, threatens to bring on the most serious federal-state controversy since the Civil War. In London Tuesday, Dr. Robert Soblen, a convicted spy, died from the after effects of a drug overdose he took last Thursday. The former psychiatrist, who'd been suffering from late-stage lymphatic leukemia, was 61 years old. Dr. Soblen fled the U.S. in June to avoid serving a life sentence for Soviet espionage. Upon arriving in Israel, where he hoped to gain asylum, the Israeli government declared that the law of return, which gives Jews the right to relocate to Israel and acquire citizenship, should not be viewed as an open invitation to Jewish criminals. After being deported from Israel on a flight back to the U.S., Dr. Soblen slashed his wrists and abdomen with a dinner knife during a stopover in London and was hospitalized. He later admitted this had not been a suicide attempt, but rather a ploy to gain entry into Britain. After British courts denied appeals for asylum, Dr. Soblen took an overdose of barbiturates the morning of his scheduled deportation. It remains unclear how he obtained the drugs, nor is it clear whether the overdose was a legitimate suicide attempt or another delaying effort. Whatever the intent, Dr. Soblen never regained consciousness. Dr. Soblen's wife, Dina, also a psychiatrist, was at his bedside when he died. According to a hospital spokesman, she was later admitted as a patient for treatment of shock. I'll have more news for you after this message.
Take a shiny object, breathe on it, and you can see your own breath. But you cannot see whether it's fresh and clean and pleasing to other people. If you want to feel safe, use Micron Oral Antiseptic. Other mouthwashes reduce the number of germs, but moments later, new ones start growing back to threaten your breath. Micron is different. It not only kills germs on contact, but it keeps the number of germs much lower, much longer, so you can feel safer hours longer. With Johnson & Johnson's new Blue Micron, most effective mouthwash you can buy to stop bad breath germs.
Here again, Joe Rubenstein.
In New York today, at a meeting of the American Chemical Society, Dr. C. Glenn King charged that Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's new book on the potential dangers of pesticides, is one-sided and could generate, quote, a public frame of mind bordering on hysteria, unquote. Silent Spring has not yet been published, but advanced portions appearing in the New Yorker magazine have caused a national sensation. Dr. Robert White Stevens, Assistant Director of American Cyanamid and a frequent spokesman for the chemical industry, echoed Dr. King's argument in a recent interview.
We do everything we possibly can to produce compounds which are toxic to insects, but not particularly toxic to animals. This is a very difficult thing to do because living processes are fairly common to all creatures. It is to be admitted that in certain cases, the use of pesticides on a large scale have reduced certain species of our wildlife in those areas. However, in general, the wildlife has quickly recovered, and the impact of these pesticides upon wildlife is really quite insignificant.
However, Dr. John Buckley, director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Research Center, disputed Dr. White Stevens' claim that the impact of pesticides on wildlife was insignificant.
I think there is no doubt that the use of pesticides has resulted in extensive damage to wildlife. We can't measure this on a continent-wide basis, but wherever we have conducted careful studies, we have had losses that averaged 80% or more. Proportionally, we've just barely made a dent in this whole field of knowledge. We've examined something like 60 compounds out of the several hundred that are in common use. We've examined their effects on not many more than a dozen species, and yet there are well over 1,000 species of birds alone. In addition, we'd like to know the levels of residues of most of the common pesticides throughout the total environment.
Ms. Carson, in a recent interview, continued to sound the alarm over pesticides.
Now, we know from experiments on animals that many of these chemicals accumulate in body tissues. We know that some are liver poisons, others are nerve poisons, and for still others we have evidence that they produce mutations. All of these things, even any one of them together, would be ample cause for caution, but I think added together, they mean that unless we do bring these chemicals under better control, we are certainly headed for disaster.
At the Aaron's Hotel in Sydney, Australia last Thursday, Lenny Bruce, the American comedian sometimes referred to as Sick, began a scheduled week-long engagement. The following morning, the engagement was canceled. The Sydney police announced that day they were investigating charges that Mr. Bruce's act was obscene. In a front-page story that featured a doctored photograph of Mr. Bruce giving a Nazi salute, the Sydney Daily Mirror claimed the comedian gave a blasphemous account of the crucifixion, along with, quote, a steady stream of dirty words, unquote. For Mr. Bruce, such charges are nothing new. The 36-year-old comedian was arrested twice last year in San Francisco and Chicago on obscenity charges. In a recent appearance on Steve Allen's television show, Mr. Bruce made humorous reference to his reputation for both improvisation and irreverence.
No, I promise continuity, I'll behave myself. I'll do all the lines that we rehearsed, That's the thing, I have a reputation for being sort of controversial and irreverent, and also the semantic bear trap of bad taste. But you might be interested in how I became offensive. It started in school with drinking, and I was like a real depressed kid, 7 or 8 years old, and I'd really get juiced and get out of my And so the teacher would really get bugged, with me singing and carrying on, and calling Columbus a fink, and boosting Aaron Burr and all that.
Mr. Bruce's defenders claim the comedian's routine should not be viewed as sick, but rather as an attempt to expose the sickness in modern society.
There's semantics. There are words that offend me. Let's see, Governor Farbus, segregation offend me, nighttime television offends me, some nighttime television. The shows that exploit homosexuality, narcotics, and prostitution under the guise of helping these societal problems.
Regarding this week's controversy, Mr. Bruce has refused to speak to the press and remains hidden in his Sydney hotel room. Said one hotel employee, quote, "He only comes out of his room at night when there's no one around. If he goes out at all, he must be climbing down the drain pipe," unquote. Another hotel worker reported that Mr. Bruce's only activities during the day were sleeping and eating ice cream. Sports, right after this.
There's Lassie, and this is Amanda Blake, Kitty of Gunsmoke. We're asking you to help save the lives of millions of dogs and cats who will die this year because they can't find homes. Only you can save them.
Right Humane Society of the United States.
In Baltimore last night, Tom Chaney, a 27-year-old journeyman pitcher, struck out a Major League record 21 batters in leading the Washington Senators to a 16-inning complete-game victory over the Orioles. The final score was 2-1. Chaney eclipsed both the all-time record of 19 strikeouts in a game set in 1884, as well as the modern mark of 18, achieved this century by Jack Combs, Bob Feller, Warren Spahn, and twice by Sandy Koufax. Of that list, only Feller and Koufax fanned 18 in the regulation 9 innings. Chaney had 13 strikeouts in the first 9. Since Baltimore's curfew law forbids an inning from starting after midnight, it became clear as the fateful hour approached that the 16th inning would be the last. Win, lose, or draw. Fortunately for Washington, Senators first baseman Bud Zipfel hit a solo home run in the top of the 16th to break the tie, and Chaney, who'd been chain-smoking between innings and was now running on pure adrenaline, kept Baltimore off the board and secured the victory. His 228th and final pitch was a called third strike on pinch hitter Dick Williams. Tonight in Baltimore, one obnoxious fan plus one excitable ball player added up to a different sort of drama when Washington's Jimmy Piersall was arrested for disorderly conduct after racing into the stands to confront 66-year-old Joseph Martin, a taunting Orioles fan. Since 1952, when Piersall underwent shock therapy following a nervous breakdown, the outfielder's personal history, combined with various on-the-field antics, have led to heckling at visiting ballparks. Tonight's incident unfolded during pre-game warm-ups when Mr. Martin repeatedly yelled from the stands, quote, "Piersall, you're a crazy man. You ought to be in Spring Grove State Hospital," unquote. Spring Grove is a mental institution in Maryland. Piersall yelled back, "Come down here and say that." And when the fan responded, "You come up here," Piersall accepted the invitation, sprinting into the stands with Washington pitcher Don Rudolph hot on his heels. According to an usher, Police Sergeant Walter Mina stopped Piersall with a body block before he could reach the fan. Rudolph, who started tonight's game for Washington, then sat on the enraged ball player to help Sergeant Mina restrain him. Piersall was taken to the police station after changing into civilian clothes. He was followed by Senators General Manager Ed Doherty, who posted a $53 bail bond, which allowed Piersall to rush back to the stadium, suit up again, and play in tonight's game. The Orioles won it 7-1. In the American League standings, the first-place New York Yankees lead the Twins by 5 games, the Angels by 5.5. The Los Angeles Dodgers lead the National League, with the Giants trailing by 2 games, the Reds by 5. And that, for this evening, completes our look at the latest news on this Thursday, September 13th, 1962. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day tomorrow.
This has been your Evening Report, a roundup of the latest news with Joe Rubenstein.